Welcome back, brothers and heretics, to Grimhammer. Tonight we're diving into the lore of the Relictors. Space Marines are obsessed with relics, especially that in the Chaos Origin. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
The omen had come out of the Emperor's tarot in fire and ash. No mortal aboard the strike cruiser, Victus, had been permitted to witness the full laying of the cards. Such mysteries belong to the Librarius, to the Reclusium, and to the will of the chapter master alone. Yet in a warship crewed by thousands of serfs and thralls, silence was no true barrier. Rumour moved through iron decks as oil moved across water, thin at first, then everywhere at once. The cards had named a drifting thing in the black, a corpse conglomeration of dead vessels and half-living machine tombs, a hulk fallen from the Empyrean, a vessel of sin, a vessel of promise, a vessel of judgment, captor of sin. When it translated out of the warp at the edge of the Styges system, the auger screens of the fire claws filled with its blasphemous silhouette. It was not a ship in any sane sense. It was a wound composed of wreckage. Broken prows from long-devoured cruisers jutted from its flanks like splintered ribs. Cathedral spires from some forgotten pilgrim ark lay half-buried in armour plating swollen by heat and corruption. Cargo holds had fused into chapels. Engine blocks the size of Hab districts protruded from masses of twisted hull metal, their machine spirits long since dead, or else howling in madness too deep for Vox to pass. Scars from the warp still crawled over it in bruised violet sheens, fading by degrees as reality reasserted its laws around the thing. Routine purge, some of the mortal officers had believed. A crippled hulk. Traitor rabble, fire and boarding torpedoes, bolter verdict, another page in the long ledger of necessary slaughters. Then the first Vox ghosts came shrilling across the fleet frequencies. They were not words at first, they were sobbing bursts of static, a wet choral murmur, men and women and children speaking over one another with mouths full of blood. Fragments of catechisms broke through the noise. Distress beacons from vessels that had vanished centuries before. Warp clipped cries for absolution, pleas to saints long uncanonized. Then, beneath the human ruin of it, another note, thin, precise, patient, as though some vast thing buried in the hulk's marrow were listening to the desperation of the dead and arranging it into music. On the Strategium deck, Chapter Master Artecus Bardane watched the hulk drift in voiceless contempt. He stood in full battle plate before the hololithic image, broad as a blast door, his armour black-edged and hard in the lumen gloom. He did not waste breath on oratory. He did not need to. Every serf and every officer within sight of him felt the pressure of his presence as surely as if a gauntlet had closed around the throat of the room. Kill runes flashed, boarding vectors were assigned, Terminator squads were marked for insertion. Breach points flared red across the corpse bulk of the hulk. Bardane raised one gauntleted hand. That was all. The command passed outward through the fleet, without another spoken word. Strike cruisers rolled into attack posture. Thunderhawk wings altered course. Boarding torpedoes armed. The Fireclaws went to war in utter silence. No battle hymn boomed over the Vox. No challenge was hurled into the void. There was only discipline, machine precision, grey death on ordered vectors. When the first torpedoes struck, the captor of sin answered with a groan that shivered through armour and bone alike. Magnetic clamps bit. Melter charges blew. Assault ramps crashed down into dark. The Fireclaws entered. Bardane led the first wave through a corridor drowned in dead lumen glow and ankle-deep blood. The Hulk's gravity stumbled with every few heartbeats, first dragging downward, then sideways, then failing entirely so that loose shell casings and severed fingers rose drifting through the air like obscene offerings. The chapter master advanced without haste, combi bolter mag locked to one fist, power blade held low in the other. His honor, guard moved with him. Shields of ceramite and adamantium canted in faultless intervals. Every step measured, every firing lane accounted for. The first renegades died before they understood they had been found. Corrupted armsmen in patchwork void suits rose from firing pits cut into the wall plating, mouths already opening around praise to dark gods, and were cut apart by disciplined bursts. Bolt shells detonated inside rib cages and throats. One traitor came on with a chain axe raised, its teeth shrieking, and Bardane split him from collar to pelvis in a single downward stroke. There was no roar of triumph, no exchange of boasts. The Fireclaws killed as executioners kill, with labour, with certainty. Farther within, Chief Librarian Dicario felt the Hulk looking back. He moved with the Terminators assigned to the Libraria's strike, his force staff held upright like a standard of office, psychic hood dimly alive across the back of his armour. Around him the air stank of machine oil, ozone, old corpses, and the sweet rot of warp taint. He felt the spiritual filth of the place as any trained psyker must. That was expected, that was ordained. But beneath the pressure of malice and the scratch of unclean thought against his wards, he sensed another current. Not hunger, not threat, invitation. It brushed the edges of his mind with an intimacy that disgusted him. Not the blunt battering of demon rage, but a beckoning. The corruption infesting the Hulk did not only wish to devour, it wished to be known, understood, handled, directed. Dicario's jaw tightened behind his helm grill. He increased the cadence of his internal litanies and forced the sensation into a locked chamber of thought. Yet it remained there, patient as a knife kept hidden beneath robes. At his shoulder moved Inquisitor Damash, cloaked in void dark mail and seal heavy plate, power axe resting against one pauldron. The Inquisitor's face was gaunt, his eyes deep set and unreadable. He did not look at Dicario when he spoke. You feel it. Dicario's reply was clipped. I feel corruption. Damash's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Corruption is a broad church. Ahead, the corridor widened into a nave assembled from the smashed remains of at least 3 vessels. Rows of pews had been nailed to the deck. Human corpses had been stacked between them in symmetrical banks, each cadaver stripped to the waist, every ribcage opened and packed with prayer parchment written in blood. Servo skulls drifted above the dead, their optics gouged out, vox units hissing at random, with fragments of liturgy and profanity in equal measure. The Terminators advanced through it, storm bolters barking in controlled pairs whenever movement broke among the corpse stacks. Mutant scavengers clawed free from beneath the dead and were stamped into paste beneath armoured boots. A thing wearing the skin of an imperial priest lurched from behind an altar of engine parts, arms opening wide in benediction. Brother Castor removed its head with one shell. Severian entered behind the killing line once the first chambers were secured. The apothecary's plate was marked in the old manner, Narthesium and Reductor gleaming wetly in the lumen murk. He moved among the fallen with practiced indifference, retrieving gene seed, administering the Emperor's mercy where required, feeding battlefield diagnostics through his helm display, even as the deck shook from distant detonations. At first, he thought the anomaly a machine error. Brother Laertes of the Third had died to a concealed plasma trap. Brother Vaughan of the Seventh had taken a renegade blade through a weakened gorget seal and bled out before the Medici protocols could bind the rupture. Their progenoid data streamed into Severian's readouts in sacred code. Red loss sigils, recovery imperatives, purity markers. Then one line snagged his attention. A divergence in endocrine response. Minor, nearly within tolerance. He rechecked it and found the same strain in the second body, though expressed through another suite of readings entirely. Severian stilled. That should not have been possible. Variation existed within every chapter. No apothecary ignorant of his duty survived long. Yet this was not that. This was a pattern that implied two different instincts in the flesh itself. Two differing echoes in the biological hymn of the gene-wrought organs. So small a disparity that any lesser man would have missed it. So persistent that once seen it could not be unseen. A servile's voice crackled over the Medici channel, requesting confirmation of tithe logs. Severian cut the link. He keyed the data into an encrypted vault within his helm and said nothing. Not yet. The shrine vault lay deep in the Hulk's heart, behind blast doors daubed with sigils that bled when scanned. Bardane ordered melter breach. The doors sagged inward in white heat, and the fire claws went through into hell. The chamber beyond had once been an engine sanctum of immense scale. Now it had been remade into a place of ritual abomination. Hundreds of living captives had been chained in concentric rings around a central dais, their flesh carved with wards and formulae, their mouths stuffed with rag strips soaked black from their own blood. Their terror was so profound, it had become a field. Dicario felt it press against him like storm surf. Within that ring stood the warband of the excoriator. They wore the ruin of old legion plate, worked over with feathers of brass, parchment skin, and lenses burning blue witch light. Rubricae moved among them like hollow kings of dust and sealed armor, firing inferno bolts from impossible stillness. Sorcerers in horned helms chanted from the dais, while captive blood ran down runnels cut into the deck, feeding a lattice of force that bent incoming fire aside. The first exchange tore men apart by the dozen. Storm bolter fire detonated through the chained ranks, flinging imperial captives into red ruin as the Tzeentchian wards drank the violence and spat it back in coils of azure fire. One Terminator vanished inside out, his armor collapsing around a burst of screaming light. Another staggered as his left arm became a mass of shrieking mouths beneath the ceramite, and Bardane himself stepped in to sever the limb before corruption reached the primary heart. "This is a ward net," Dicario voxed. "The captives are the anchors." Bardane's reply came without hesitation. "Vent the compartment. There are loyal imperial souls within it," said one of the squad sergeants. Bardane did not even turn his helm. "There are only munitions and obstacles. Execute." The order ran hard across command channels. Breach charges were thrown against the outer bulkheads. Maglocks were cut. Emergency seals along the adjoining corridor slammed down. The fire claws withdrew by disciplined bounds, while the traitors howled their praises and the chained prisoners tried to scream through the cloth in their mouths. Then the hull opened. Void claimed the chamber in an instant. Atmosphere blasted outward in a shrieking torrent of blood, parchment, chains, bodies, and machine shards. The prisoners went spinning into the black in a storm of human wreckage. Rubricae were torn from their firing stances and smashed against the vaulted ceiling. Sorcerers lost their footing and their wards guttered. 100 mortal lives were spent in a heartbeat so that the fire claws might strip one layer of defense from the enemy. No brother spoke against it. When the emergency shutters sealed again, and atmosphere began hissing back into the adjoining kill zone, The Space Marines re-entered through a second breach like wrath-given shape. They found the survivors among frozen clots of blood and spiraling scraps of skin. Bardain killed 3 traitors in the first seconds. Damash split another from helm to groin with his power axe. Decario strode through the dead toward the dais, following that impossible inner summons deeper into the carnage. There he found the excoriator. The champion of Tzeentch was huge, even by transhuman measure, his armor scaled in shifting cobalt and diseased gold, his face hidden behind a beaked helm from whose eye lenses leaked witchfire. In his fists, he held a blade that did not belong to metal. It looked forged, yes, and edged, yes. But the thing within it shifted against its shape, as though steel were only a prison outline, drawn around a captive scream. The excoriator met Decario head-on. The blow that followed would have cored a dreadnought sarcophagus. Decario caught it on his force staff and felt every ward in the weapon shriek with strain. Damash came in low, power axe crashing against the traitor's side, but the champion's armor turned the strike with only a shower of sparks. The excoriator riposted with impossible speed. The demon blade cut across Damash's breastplate and sheared through. Sanctified metal, throwing the Inquisitor to one knee in a bloom of arterial mist. Decario saw then what the thing in the sword was. Not with the eyes of flesh, but with the second sight. A bound intelligence, caged malice. A predator hammered into obedience through rites so abominable that the memory of them had stained the weapon forever. The invitation returned, not for worship, for use. He drove his staff into the excoriator's throat grill with all the strength in his transhuman frame, forcing the traitor back one step. Damash, gasping, buried the head of his axe in the champion's knee joint. The excoriator staggered. In that instant, the demon blade turned in the renegade's hand, alive with rage, and Decario understood that its loyalty was not to its wielder at all. It was to slaughter. So he took it. His gauntlet closed over the hilt. Every purity seal on his armor blackened at once. Cold fire shot through his arm and bit into the roots of his mind. He heard laughter without sound. He heard promises. He heard the blade testing the limits of his soul like a beast worrying chain. Decario roared a denial into the abyss of it and rammed the weapon upward through the excoriator's helm. The champion died in a burst of foul light. The remaining traitors broke. Some died fighting. Some tried to flee and were hunted down through the decks in disciplined kill teams. One sorcerer was taken alive after Bardain severed both his arms and nailed him to a ruptured bulkhead with the spikes of his own staff. Half flayed from his wounds, blood freezing in black lace across his chest, the captive sorcerer stared at the fire claws through a face split almost to the ear. He looked first at Bardain, then at Decario, then at Severian, who had come to claim the fallen. He laughed through broken teeth. "Sons of 2 dead fathers," he whispered. "Little grave-born mongrels. You do not even know which ghosts gnaw at your blood." Ilonus, then a line captain and not yet the grim relic bearer he would become, raised his bolt pistol to end the heretic. "Wait," said Severian before he knew he meant to speak. Bardain's helm turned towards him with glacial slowness. The apothecary felt the hidden data vault inside his helm like a live charge. He thought of the divergent readings, the impossible echo in the progenoid behavior. He said nothing further. Bardain gave the smallest motion of his hand. Ilonus fired. The sorcerer's head burst across the bulkhead in a wet fan of bone and brains. Silence returned by degrees as the last compartments were secured. the captor of sin was purged. Its surviving machine cores were tagged for scuttle. Mortal support teams were sent aboard under guard to assist with the dead, the salvage, the recording of the action. In the central sanctum, Bardan, Damash, and Decario stood around the demon blade resting on a slab of fractured altar stone. The weapon had been wrapped in chains and wardcloth. Even so, men outside the chamber reported hearing whispers through sealed helms. "It should be destroyed," Bardan said. His voice was low, iron hard, without visible doubt. Damash pressed a gloved hand against the split in his armor, blood drying black around the wound. His eyes never left the sword. Should is the language of safer ages. Decario said nothing. The Inquisitor looked to him. "You held it, and were not consumed." "Not yet," Decario replied. "Not yet is more than most men are granted," Damash said. "Chaos is not beaten by righteousness alone. If that were so, this galaxy would already be clean. The arch-enemy may be slain by its own fangs, if the will of the wielder is absolute." Bardane's stare could have cored stone. "You ask a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes to keep a demon weapon. I ask warriors to think as warriors," said Damash. "Ignorance is not purity. Blindness is not faith." At last, Decario spoke, his gaze fixed on the chained blade. "A weapon does not become holy by ignorance." The words hung in the chamber like a verdict. Bardane did not answer at once. Far below them, mortal crew were still hauling bodies, still praising the Emperor for deliverance, still trusting that the giants they served had come and gone in unimpeachable loyalty. The chapter master heard none of it. He looked only at the weapon and at the two men beside him, one radical by office, one by awakening. Then he gave the order that would fester in the marrow of the chapter for centuries. The blade was not entered into the common purgation logs. The sanctum-picked captures were seized. Surviving mortal auxiliaries who had seen too much were gathered under pretext of debriefing and executed in sealed cargo bays, their corpses vented into the dark without prayer. Official records were amended. The excoriator was listed as slain by conventional means. No mention was made of the weapon. No mention was made of the moment Decario had taken it into his hand. Severian signed the casualty rolls with his own gene-sealed authority and felt the lie settling over the chapter like a funeral shroud. In the privacy of the apothecarian vault, he reopened the encrypted file on the divergent progenoid responses and stared at it until the runes blurred. One lie within the blood, another within the record. He locked both away. Hours later, with melter charges set deep in the Hulk's core and the last boarding parties withdrawn, the Fireclaws departed the captor of sin. From the viewing galleries of the strike cruisers, serfs watched the corpse conglomeration blossom into chains of light as scuttling charges rippled through its fused organs and dead engines. The Hulk came apart in majestic ruin, shedding cathedrals and armor plates into the black. A floating mausoleum put to the sword, a righteous victory, another evil cast down by the Emperor's angels. That was how it would be spoken of in every formal record. But as the fleet turned from the wreck and set course for home, the truth travelled with them in hidden vaults and guarded thoughts. They had not merely destroyed a tainted thing. They had opened it, listened to it, learned from it. They had taken a blade from the hand of damnation and named the act necessity. The captor of sin burned behind them, yet a fragment of its darkness remained alive within the hearts of the victors. It would not be the last wound they carried. Years passed in blood and cinder, and the name Fireclaws was left behind, like a skin flensed from living meat. The chapter did not speak of the change in the hearing of serfs. No proclamation was thundered from the fortress monastery vaults. No triumphal rite was shared with the worlds that tithed sons into their gene banks. Yet the change came all the same, first as a murmur among void navigators and astropaths, then as a word of fear spoken by imperial commanders who had fought in the eye's long shadow and had seen grey-clad giants descend from the black with vault chains hanging from their gunships, Relictors. It was not a title of honor, it was a judgment hidden within a name. The wars around the Eye of Terror had no beginning that a sane man could point to and say there. They had raged before the living memory of men, and would rage after every mortal tongue that named them had rotted into dust. Worlds burned in that region by custom as often as by invasion. Pilgrim routes vanished, shrine moons were reduced to molten debris. Regiments of the Astra Militarum marched into the ash wastes of damned planets under banners already stained by the knowledge that no relief would come if the enemy broke the line. Whole populations lived one prayer away from madness. Into that charnel breadth of war, the newly named Relictors went again and again, not merely to wage battle, but to search. They hunted shrines raised by apostates in the rust deserts of dead forge worlds. They boarded void hulks that reeked of old heresy and older things still. They descended upon demon-haunted keeps buried in ice and scourged the stones with melter and promethium until hidden reliquaries cracked open in the heat. They learned to read spore in battlefields that ordinary commanders called victory or defeat. If a war zone had birthed sorcery, if a cult had flourished too long, if a traitor warlord had fought with curious boldness, then the Relictors asked not merely who had died there, but what had been left behind. Each campaign added another chain-bound blasphemy to the hidden vaults of the chapter. Each victory made them more terrible. They became whispered legends among the soldiery of the Imperium. Grey-armoured angels of death who appeared where the warp had cut too deeply into the skin of reality. Grey executioners who slew not only with bolter and chainsword, but with powers no loyal servant of terror should have touched and lived. Men of the guard who survived battles at their side remembered impossible things and said them only when drink or nightmares loosened the tongue. A black helm that breathed frost without a wearer. A blade that drank the smoke from burning flesh and sang in a child's voice. A brass censer swung by a silent giant while diamonds writhed and blackened in the fumes. The survivors were seldom believed. The dead did not argue. Within the chapter, Decario's shadow lengthened. At first, the librarius had merely advised, as was proper. Divination before war, prognostication upon the Emperor's tarot, psychic warding against the Empyrean and its abominations. Such duties were old, sanctioned, and girded by sacred law. Yet the Hulk had changed more than a name. Since the death of the Excoriator and the taking of the Demon Blade, Decario had become a figure around whom more and more of the chapter's secret life began to turn. He did not openly command company captains. He had no need. A word from him to Bardane was enough to alter fleet headings. A warning spoken in the conclaves of the senior officers was enough to condemn a world to fire or spare a city for later use. He surrounded himself with scrolls sealed by sigils of censure, forbidden transcripts, apothegms preserved from Ordo Malleus crypts, testimonia ripped from the libraries of dead radicals. The librarius vaults became places where incense burned night and day, not merely to sanctify, but to choke the air so thick with rite and smoke that any brother entering felt as though he walked into the lungs of some dreaming beast. Candles guttered before suspended relic shards. Auspex arrays hummed beside chains of ward silver. Bound books whose parchment had once been skin lay open on iron stands, their margins crowded with Decario's severe hand. It was he who marked the patterns within wars. He who saw where demonic manifestations clustered. He who began to say that chance had no place in the Emperor's design, only hidden vectors to be discerned by those with the courage to look. Bardane listened. The chapter master had always been a hard thing. Before his elevation, he had been known as a warrior of pitiless instinct and exacting will, a commander who treated hesitation as a form of weakness, not far removed from treachery. Years and command had not softened him. They had pared him down to something even colder. He loved no flourish and despised all sentiment in war. He did not speak of sacrifice as though it were noble. He spoke of it as though it were arithmetic. A world called Vanna's Reach learned this when its governor begged for deliverance. The planet stood along a route by which traitor flotillas had begun passing munitions and enslaved populations into a widening corridor of rebellion. It possessed manufactoria enough to matter, labor populations enough to be useful, and void defenses too weak to withstand a determined attack. The governor petitioned for aid. He received it. 3 regiments of the Astra Militarum made planetfall. The Relictors descended thereafter, not to stand beside the regiments in common defense, but to use the world as a blade trap. Bardane let the enemy land in strength. Let the traitors push inland through habtiers and ash farms. Let the guard break themselves in holding actions that cost 100,000 lives. Only when the enemy committed its sorcerers, its war engines, and the caskets of profane relics they had come to implant beneath the capital, did the Relictors fall upon them in full wrath. They annihilated the invaders. Then Bardane ordered cyclonic sterilization upon the central continent. The governor screamed his protest over Vox and was cut off mid-sentence when the palace void shields failed. The surviving regiments, or what remained of them, were not permitted evacuation, nor were the hive populations whom the guard had bled to preserve. Bardane watched the first firestorms blossom in the atmosphere and said only that the enemy route had been denied. When a captain of the guard, his face half flayed by shrapnel and smoke, was dragged before him and demanded to know why loyal men had been abandoned after winning the field, Bardane answered with the same chill contempt he used for all mortal outrage. "You did not win the field, Colonel. You occupied it long enough for me to decide it was no longer worth keeping." The colonel was executed for insolence before the hour was out. So the campaigns went. Worlds saved by any conventional accounting, then quietly mutilated so their ruins could reveal hidden shrines. Demon incursions checked at impossible cost. Rebel holdings burned so deep that centuries would pass before crops could again grow in the poisoned earth. The Relictors became renowned for victory and distrusted for the shape of it. Imperial commanders requested their aid and prayed afterward that no one above them in the chain of command would ask too many questions. In the hidden places of the chapter, Severian pursued his own war. He did not do so with blade or bolter. He did it in gene labs lit by pale lumen strips and in archives where old tissue records slept in layered code. He did it in silence between campaigns, while the strike cruisers slid through the void and the brethren above him prepared for yet another massacre. He drew progenoid data from fallen brothers separated by years, by company, by battlefield, by implantation cycle. He compared endocrine cascades, osmodular responses, biscopea growth rhythms, neuroglottis tolerances, catalepsian drift. Each time he told himself the contradiction would vanish under greater sample size. Each time it sharpened. 2 notes in one hymn. Not enough to produce visible disharmony in the flesh. Not enough to make a brother less than a space marine, less than perfect in war, less than absolute in devotion, but enough that the records would not lie to him if he looked long enough. Some organs expressed one pattern of resilience, others another. Tiny variances rippled through generations of implants as though some hidden hand had mixed lines that sacred law declared should remain inviolate. At moments, the data suggested contamination, at others, design. At others still, some older wound inflicted by Mechanicus meddlers and buried under false litanies of purity. Severian trusted no one with the full sum of it. Not yet. The manufactorum world of Gathis Ultor gave him other fears. It was a forge sprawl built under permanent cloud, its skies reddened by furnace glare, and its lower worker districts sealed in fumes so thick that men coughed blood into filtration masks before reaching middle years. The chapter came there at Damarsh's urging, though officially they had answered a plea for aid against a demon cult infecting the labour masses. That much was true. What the plea omitted was the manner of possession spreading through the population. It hid. Not in the obvious mutants, nor in the flagellant packs chanting in the drainage catacombs, but in the foremen, the overseers, the machine priests, the hab preachers and shiftmasters, who still passed every visible rite of loyalty. Men who spoke the right prayers and gave the right signs of devotion while carrying the warp like a spark under dead ash. The Relictors purged for 3 days through the upper foundries and lower vent mazes. Bolter fire boomed through furnace halls vast as cathedrals. Chainswards screamed over conveyor trenches full of dismembered labourers. Possessed workers burst apart under disciplined volleys, their bodies splitting open to release clawed things woven of shadow, steam, and meat. Ilonus walked at Bardane's right hand throughout the slaughter, a hard-faced veteran in black and grey, his helm clipped to his belt, his scarred features unreadable beneath soot and old blade marks. He was one of the chapter master's honour guard, and perhaps the least demonstrative of them all. He did not praise the path they walked. He did not question it. Obedience in him had become a mineral thing. At the heart of the primary refinery, Decario ordered the relic brought forth. It was a sphere of black glass bound in silver cagework and hung with purity seals that twitched, though no wind stirred the furnace hall. The artifact had been taken months before from the tomb of a traitor seer. No brother below the rank of veteran knew its true provenance. The mortals of Gathis Ultor believed it an instrument of exorcism sanctioned by the Inquisition. Bardane gave the command. Decario broke the outer seal. The sphere opened like an eye. There was no flash, no thunder, only a pulse of impossible recognition that rolled through the refinery and out across the hive in widening unseen rings. Men fell where they stood. Some convulsed and vomited blood. Others dropped to their knees with tears flooding from their eyes. Across the Voxnet came 100 sudden screams as hidden possession was dragged into the light. Overseers seized up and burst from within as demons clawed their way free. Priests who had preached loyalty drew pistols and opened fire upon their own congregations. Skitari patrols turned on one another as machine spirits bucked under unclean infestation. For 6 hours, the Relictors hunted what the relic had exposed. For 6 more, they hunted all who had witnessed the exposure. When the sunless dawn of Gathis Ultor came, it shone over a silent forge world. Every surviving labour enclave, every barracks, every surviving adept enclosure, every medica station, every shrine, all of it was put to the sword or the flame. No witness was spared. No testimony remained. Millions died, not because they were proven corrupt, but because they had seen the instrument by which corruption had been named. Severian walked among the heaps afterward, reclaiming gene seed from the fallen and watching the dead manufacturing workers steam in the chill rain of ash drifting down from split smokestacks. A mortal adept still lived beneath one crushed gantry, both legs, gone, guts pooled black in oil and blood. He caught sight of Severian and tried to speak praise. The apothecary gave him the Emperor's mercy before the words could finish. Back aboard the fortress monastery, the reliquary decks deepened in number and in dread. No litany spoken by the chapter's serfs could wholly bury what those decks had become. Weapons hung in stasis cages surrounded by scriptural wards and iron thorns. Helms with no wearers breathed fog against the glass. Chains coiled around hafts carved from materials not listed in any Mechanicus inventory. Censers dripped blood that never clotted. A pair of gauntlets recovered from a champion of the blood god flexed in their bindings whenever fresh kill reports were brought into the chamber. One shattered icon shed tears of salt water whenever a warp storm opened nearby. There were whispering blades. There were books that turned their own pages. There were shriveled tongues suspended in crystal tubes, each tagged with the sigils of a language no loyal servant should know. Brothers going to war knelt before those vaults now. Not to worship, never that. To select, to arm, to become, by measured degrees, less clean than they had been. It was not all accepted in silence. The chapter's master of sanctity, Malak Varn, voiced his condemnation in the Hall of Oaths before captains, librarians, and chosen veterans. He was a stern and terrible man, his crozius scarred by 100 campaigns, and his skull helm resting beneath one arm as he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "We are replacing hatred with fascination," he said. "We were made to scour the unclean from existence, not catalogue it, not cherish it, not bind it in our vaults, and return to it as misers return to coin. We descend by naming Dissent necessity." No one interrupted him. Even Decario kept still. At length, Bardane rose from the command throne and descended the basalt steps until he stood eye to eye with the chaplain. The chamber seemed to tighten around the two of them. "Show me the world we failed to save through mercy," Bardane said. Varn's jaw hardened. "That is not the measure." "It is the only measure," Bardane replied. "The dead do not rise comforted because our hands were clean when they should have been bloody. The Imperium is not guarded by revulsion. It is guarded by victory." Varn looked to the assembled captains and found no support there. Some lowered their gaze. Some stared back in stony acceptance. Ilonus did not move at all. Decario watched like a prophet waiting to see which scripture would be chosen. The Master of Sanctity bowed his head at last, not in agreement, but in submission to the chain of command. That night, he was reassigned to distant fleet duties and never again stood within the inner vaults. After that, resistance withered. It did not vanish. Brothers still muttered private litanies of warning. Veteran sergeants still exchanged hard glances when yet another chained horror was borne down into the reliquary decks. Yet the victories continued, and victory has a cruelty all its own. It silences conscience by making doubt look like weakness. Decario gave that silence a theology. In the inner conclaves, he began to speak not merely of discipline, but of purpose, not merely of endurance, but of design. He had watched brothers touch relics that should have unmade them and remain standing. He had seen the warp claw at the mind of the chapter and fail to find easy purchase. What if, he asked, that resilience was not chance? What if there was something in the chapter's blood, some old and hidden singularity that made the brethren fit for this labor, where others would fall at once into madness. Severian heard of these arguments and felt ice gather beneath his skin. He had not shown his evidence. He had not named the contradiction in the progenoid records. Yet Decario spoke as though he sensed it anyway, as though the secret rot or secret strength hidden in the gene seed were already a doctrine waiting to be crowned. A flaw became a sign became an election became permission. That was how damnation entered strongholds, not always by breach and claw, sometimes by interpretation. When next the fleet turned toward the eye, the transformation was complete in all but formal declaration. The chapter still knelt to the emperor, still recited the catechisms of battle, still scourged the mutant, the traitor and the witch in torrents of holy bolt shells. No outsider looking upon their banners in that hour would have called them anything but loyal sons of the Imperium. Yet within their vaults, within their councils, within the thoughts they no longer voiced except among themselves, another certainty had taken root. They alone had the courage to use damnation as an instrument, and because they believed it, they became more dangerous than any enemy that knew itself to be lost. Judgment came upon them in the full splendor of imperial wrath. The fortress monastery had endured warp storm, void siege, raider assault, and the long attrition of centuries. Yet on the day of reckoning, it seemed suddenly small beneath the gaze of those who came to measure it. Augustations marked the first translations in the outer dark, then the second, then the third. One fleet signal grew into many, each rune carrying authority so ancient and so absolute that even the most hardened surf crews fell to their knees before the cogitator shrines and began chanting litanies against annihilation. A battleship of the Emperor class came first through the black, vast enough to dwarf escorts into insignificance, its broadside towers and cathedral superstructure haloed in engine glare, like a floating city of judgment. Around it, translated attendant cruisers, inquisitorial black ships, and the war vessels of 4 Adeptus Astartes chapters, their hulls marked in the livery of brotherhoods whose masters had come not as peers, in honor, but as witnesses to sentence. No war hails were exchanged. No requests for parley were offered. The first Vox transmission that reached the inner command sanctum of the Relictors carried only a demand: stand to accounting. Artecus Bardane heard it from the basalt command throne and did not rise at once. Grey armoured captains lined the chamber in absolute stillness. To his right stood Ilonus of the Honour Guard, hands folded over the pommel of his sheathed power sword, his scarred face hard as worked stone. To the left stood Chief Librarian Decario in darkened plate beneath a mantle of ward parchment, his gaze fixed on the hololithic bloom of enemy tonnage gathering around the monastery like wolves around a wounded grox. No one spoke until the second transmission came. By order of the Holy Ordos, by the witness of the Adeptus Astartes, by the unbroken law of terror, open your gates and submit to tribunal. Still, Bardane remained silent. It was Severian who felt the first true pulse of dread, not because the fleet could break them, though it could, nor because the hidden vaults were full, though they were, but because he saw in Bardane's posture the shape of a thought already concluded. The chapter master did not look angered. He did not look cornered. He looked measuring, as though the destruction of his own house were a cost to be weighed against the preservation of a doctrine. At last Bardane rose. "Open the gates," he said. That was all. The tribunal was held in the Hall of Oaths beneath the iron statues of dead masters. In another age, the chamber had been a place of consecration and command election. On that day, it became a court. Inquisitors in layered black stood upon the raised dais, their rosettes gleaming like old wounds in the lumen gloom. The 4 visiting chapter masters kept their helms on, faceplates unreadable, each attended by chosen veterans in full warplate. A rank of grey armoured Relictors stood opposite them, motionless and unbowed. Dimash was there under armed guard, not in chains, because no man with his authority was ever truly chained until the blade was already descending. Bardane and Dicario stood in the centre alone. The charges were read without flourish: unlawful retention of profane artifacts, concealment of relic use from imperial authorities, doctrinal corruption, association with radical inquisitorial thought, tactical employment of prescribed warp implements, unauthorized study of forbidden texts, deviance from established modes of extermination, moral contamination of chapter command. No word of it was false. When the reading ended, one of the inquisitors spoke. His face was wasted by augmetic graft and old scar tissue, one eye replaced by a red glass optic that burned without warmth. "Do you deny these charges?" Bardane answered before Dicario could speak. "No." The words struck the hall harder than any denial would have. A murmur moved among the mortal scribes and servitors. One of the witness chapter masters shifted his grip upon the haft of his Crozius. Dimash gave a dry little smile, as though hearing a line he had always known would come. The Inquisitor's red eye narrowed. "Then defend yourselves." Bardane did not kneel. He did not plead. He spoke as though giving after action review to subordinates. "Purity alone loses worlds," he said. "Hatred alone does not cage the warp. Faith alone does not stop the hand that has already taken up the demon blade. We have faced that which devours sectors. We have stood where entire regiments broke in one night beneath sorcerous assault. We learned. We adapted. We used the enemy's strength to break the enemy's throat. You touched corruption and call it adaptation," another Inquisitor said. "I touched victory," Bardane replied. "You speak because there remain worlds where men yet live to hear you." Dicario's voice followed, colder and more measured. "The arch-enemy wages war in the material and the immaterial alike. To refuse knowledge of his weapons is not piety, it is self-maiming. We took what was unclean and bent it toward righteous slaughter. We did not kneel to it, we mastered it." One of the chapter masters stepped forward then, azure armor chased in gold, a giant among giants, his voice like a hammer-striking tombstone. "No servant master's damnation. He survives it for a time and mistakes duration for dominion." Dicario met that faceless stare without flinching. "Then time is all that is required." That answer nearly ended the tribunal in blood. Hands tightened on weapon grips across the chamber. One of the Inquisitors made the sign for restraint, though his expression promised a later reckoning. Dimash alone laughed. When he was ordered to speak, he did so with the ease of a man already dead in every useful sense. "I counseled them," he said. "I guided them. I sanctioned what you now condemn. If the fault is to be borne, lay it upon me first. I told them what you all know but fear to say aloud. The warp is not beaten by blindness. You are already condemned," one of the Inquisitors said. Dimash inclined his head. "Then I am at peace, for I was condemned the first moment I chose efficacy over comfort." The sentence did not fall at once. There were hours of closed conclave, whispered judgment, machine scribes scratching out amended decrees, while honor guards watched one another over chamber thresholds with the stillness of loaded weapons. When the doors finally opened, The terms were spoken before the whole command cadre of the chapter. All profane relics were to be surrendered into inquisitorial custody. All hidden vaults were to be opened. Inquisitor de Marche was to be remanded for immediate transport and final judgment. The chapter was stripped of feudal rights over Neutra. Its right of tithe and recruitment from its sworn domains was suspended. Its command autonomy was reduced beneath the eye of imperial oversight. For 100 years, it would undertake penitent service at the hottest fronts against the arch-enemy, there to wash suspicion in blood. The humiliation landed like a blade driven through the heart of the monastery. Neutra had not merely been a world upon a chart. It had been root, memory, inheritance. Its fortress shrines held the names of lineages from which aspirants had come for generations. Its ash plains and feral bastions had shaped the trial rites of the chapter. Its people had known the tread of Relictor boots as a sign of judgment and protection alike. To strip that right was not only administrative punishment, it was cultural mutilation. It severed a line running from dead masters to unborn neophytes. Bardain received the sentence without visible reaction. So too did most of the captains, though Severian saw the strain written in the set of their jaws and the slight flaring of nostrils behind helm grills. Only Decario showed something different. Not grief, not fury. Something colder. Calculation recast as liturgy. The vaults were opened in the presence of the tribunal. That day became a scar in every memory that witnessed it. Relic cages were dragged from hidden recesses beneath the monastery by servo haulers and chained thralls. Stasis crypts were unsealed beneath ward fields and censer smoke. The gathered inquisitors saw helms that exhaled in the dark, blades that whispered in languages too old for mankind, censers that wept blood into silver catch pans, a black sphere bound in cagework, bound tongues in crystal tubes, rune-scorched gauntlets that twitched in their manacles, shattered icons that cried saltwater at the nearness of warp storms. Mortal scribes fainted. One of the visiting serfs went mad before the hour was out and bit through his own tongue. De Marche was taken away beneath guard after the third vault. He paused only once, turning his head toward Bardain and Decario, where they stood between lines of armed witnesses. He looked old then, very old, the kind of old that came not from years, but from carrying too much knowledge too far into the dark. "Do not mistake delay for absolution," he said. It was impossible to know whether he spoke to them or to the men who had condemned him. Then he was gone. Severian chose that day to commit his own treachery. Not treachery against the chapter, never that. Treachery against the men who would strip it to bone and call the ruin purification. He had prepared for the possibility long before the fleet arrived. Within a forgotten alcove in the apothecarian gene crypts, behind a false shrine panel and 3 redundant purity seals, he hid a sealed data casket containing the full weight of his diagnostic records: progenoid drift, tissue contradictions, endocrine anomalies, implant pattern divergence across companies and generations. Every clue he had gathered toward the hidden fracture in the blood. If the chapter survived the coming penance, it would need that truth. If it did not, then at least the truth would not be burned by strangers who called ignorance virtue. Beside the data casket, he set another object wrapped in plain grey cloth. A shard of black glass, no longer than a battle brother's thumb, flensed long ago from the sphere that had opened like an eye on Gathis Ultor. He should have destroyed it. He knew that. He concealed it instead. When the penance began, it did not make the chapter humble. It made them leaner. Their fleet turned away from the stripped bones of old rites and entered the long years of public obedience. They answered calls to battle at the edge of the eye. They fought on shrine moons overrun by word-bearers. They broke traitor armor columns in sulfur wastelands where the sand turned black under Promethean rain. They boarded plague hulks with orthodox flame units first, reciting every approved catechism into the vox so that recording augurs would capture nothing improper. They stood beside other imperial forces and fought as exemplars of visible purity, their bolters singing lawful death, their chaplains bellowing sanctioned hatred, their librarians shrouded in the proper forms of restraint. In public, they had learned obedience. In shadow, they had merely learned patience. Where a battlefield yielded a broken sealstone bearing demonic script, it vanished before the logisticians inventoried the dead. Where a traitor sanctum collapsed and left behind half-burned codices or scorched tablets of invocation, such things found their way into sealed reliquaries marked as contaminated refuse. Where sorcerers died under artillery and the dust settled over their amulets, their eye gems, their rune chains and blooded scrolls, grey-armoured hands were often the first to search the corpses. The penance crusade became a mask worn over the old hunger. Imperial commanders felt it even when they could not name it. On Jovar Tertius, the Relictors were ordered to reinforce a defensive line around 3 hive bastions and hold until relief from the Astra Militarum Reserve arrived. Bardane obeyed for exactly as long as it took to identify the deeper significance of the enemy push. A coven of traitor psychers was moving toward an underhive archive sealed since the age of apostasy. The hives above contained 8 million loyal citizens and 2 full guard armies. Bardane diverted 3 companies away from the bastion line without warning, struck into the underhive, slew the coven, and reclaimed a cache of forbidden tablets from beneath the broken archive doors. The hives fell before relief arrived. When the surviving Lord General demanded explanation through a haze of smoke and corpse stench, Bardane replied only that the loss of 3 cities was preferable to the release of what had been hidden beneath them. The Lord General never again asked for the Relictors by name. Within the Chapter 1 last voice tried to rise against the drift. Malak Varn, once Master of Sanctity, had endured reassignment, silence, and years of being carefully excluded from the deepest councils. Yet age had not broken him, and hatred of corruption still burned in him as brightly as it had when first he had denounced the hidden vaults. During the penance, he saw enough to understand that the surrender had been incomplete, the repentance a performance before outside eyes. He came to Bardane in the arming chapel, before a boarding action against a traitor cruiser, and spoke without witness save Ilonus. "I know what you continue to do," Varn said. The old fury was still in him, buried beneath ritual discipline but never quenched. "I have seen shards withheld from pyres. I have seen Decario's chosen enter locked vaults after every campaign. I will speak before the chapter if I must. If this house still has a soul, it will hear me." Bardane regarded him in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "We go to war." The boarding action that followed was fought in a broken cruiser drifting close to the eye's red. Storms. Combat raged chamber by chamber through darkened gun decks and shattered cloisters infested by traitor marines. Varn was in the van, Crozius blazing, Skullhelm grinning pale in the muzzle flash as he crushed a path through corrupted deck serfs and legionary thralls. No one saw exactly what happened in the breach corridor near the ship's ruined chapel. That was the convenience of void war. So much noise, so many angles, so many deaths. What was known afterward was simple. Varn pushed ahead. Support lagged by moments that should not have lagged. The blast shutters behind him slammed without command acknowledgement. A shaped charge detonated in the adjoining bulkhead. Then traitor fire tore through the isolated chamber, while the rest of the squad forced the seals back open against impossible delay. When at last they reached him, Varn was dead on one knee, Crozius broken, one hand still clawed around the throat of a slain traitor. No brother voiced suspicion aloud. None needed to. After Varn's death, Decario changed in ways even the most loyal could not wholly ignore. He became less like a librarian in the old mold and more like a priest of some harder dispensation. His speech lost what little warmth it had ever contained. He spoke now of will as other men spoke of grace, not as one virtue among many, but as the first and only wall between the warrior and corruption. Purity seals, rites, catechisms, ablutions, oaths, all useful, he said, but secondary. The only true ward was conquest of the self so complete that even damnation could be gripped and made obedient. Some brothers heard strength in that. Others heard blasphemy wrapped in discipline. Years of ash and blood ground onward. The chapter survived by becoming ever more inward, ever more secretive, ever more dependent on its own hidden certainties. Neutra faded into memory. Recruitment lines shifted to harsher, more uncertain worlds. New initiates came without the old cultural inheritance. The chapter became less a brotherhood rooted in domain and right, more a moving fortress of iron doctrine and concealed shame. Then the warp began to writhe with a new violence. Astropaths bled from the ears in their harness thrones. Navigators woke from trance, clawing at their veils. Stormfronts boiled around regions long deemed stable. Across a dozen war zones, the name of one world rose again and again through broken pleas for reinforcement, greenskin infestations, and strategic panic. Armageddon. On the night the omens aligned, Decario entered trance within the innermost sanctum of the Librarius and did not emerge until the third watch. When he came before Bardane, his face looked carved from winter stone. "I have seen it," he said. Bardane stood from the command throne. "Speak." "A black pyramid," Decario said. "Not stone, not metal, a wound in shape, buried in diseased jungle earth while the world above drowns in war. I heard it call through the storm, not to all men, to us." Severian, standing in attendance with Ilonus and the senior captains, felt the chamber temperature fall, though no vents had changed. "Armageddon," Bardane said. Decario inclined his head once. Beneath the word lay a second truth, darker than the first. Whatever storm awaited them on that world, whatever billions would burn in hive and ash waste and jungle rot, the Relictors had already chosen what they would seek there. Not salvation, never salvation. Something buried, something forbidden, something calling from beneath a planet already preparing to drown in blood. Armageddon was not a world at war. It was war given continental mass. From orbit, the planet appeared less like a sphere than a furnace skull. Its cloud bands bruised black by smoke and stained from within by the orange pulse of bombardment. Hive cities burned in long, wounded lines across the continents. Whole industrial belts glowed red where promethium reservoirs had burst and poured fire through habstacks thick with the dead. In the ash wastes, armor columns crawled beneath storms of soot like iron lice crossing a carcass. In the void above, imperial warships exchanged lance fire with orc hulks and kill cruisers amid widening veils of wreckage. The heavens themselves becoming a graveyard of tumbling plate, blown decks, and frozen human ruin. Billions lived below. Billions were being spent. The first reports laid before Bardane in the strategium of the fortress monastery were not reports in any human sense. They were casualty mountains rendered into script, hive output losses, population projections adjusted downward by the hour, steel legion formations shattered, recombined, then shattered again, entire districts overrun, manufactorum belts turned into kill zones where the dead had begun to alter the temperature of the air simply by lying where they had fallen in such monstrous number. Orc spores blooming in the ruins as fast as the Imperium could burn them out. Cities becoming meat, grinders, plains becoming scrapyards, shrine districts becoming pyres. It was magnificent in the old, hateful manner of the age of the Imperium, vast beyond mortal ownership, cruel enough to be called necessary by men who would never step into the blood. When the Relictors translated into the war zone in full chapter strength, the difference was immediate and obscene. All 10 companies answered the call. Strike cruisers and escorts slipped from the void in disciplined array, their launch bays vomiting thunderhawks and dropcraft into the furnace atmosphere. The Astra Militarum fought Armageddon by endurance, by trenches and barrages, and the measured feeding of men into the line. The Planetary Defense Force fought by desperation and attrition, holding refinery walls and hab blocks until the walls vanished and the hab blocks became tombs. The Relictors came down like sentence. Grey armoured giants struck at the hinge points of the war. Orc bastions that had resisted artillery for weeks died in minutes beneath disciplined melter breaches and room-by-room slaughter. Gargant assembly yards were turned into abattoirs as veteran squads advanced through fire and iron, blowing out knee joints, ripping open fuel guts, and climbing smoking wrecks to plant charges in the machine hearts, while greenskins boiled around them in roaring green tides. Valleys of scrap and corpses filled with the thunder of bolters. Chain blades shrieked. Power swords crackled through necks, ribs, spines, jaws. The Relictors moved with that cold, pitiless economy which made Astartes warfare seem less like battle than execution on an industrial scale. Imperial picked feeds seized upon them at once. Grey angels, deliverers, the Emperor's wrath descending in ordered cohorts. In one Hab district, a wall of Orc armour was broken in under half an hour by a spear thrust of Terminators and Assault Brethren, and the aftermath became a thing of whispered legend among the surviving civilians. Mountains of butchered greenskins lay between the smoking shell of the Hab wall and the ash fields beyond, so many dead that the labour crews sent to clear the breach simply stopped and stared until their officers began beating them back to work. That was the public face. The private one began in the command vault beneath the Strategium, where no mortal ears were permitted, and the air smelled of machine oil, incense, and the iron tang of weapon racks freshly stocked for planetary war. Bardane stood before a hololithic globe of Armageddon, its surface swarmed by tactical sigils, ruin markers, and battlefront runes. Around him stood the senior captains, Decario robed in shadow and ward parchment, Ilonus silent at the chapter master's shoulder, and Captain Magar of the 4th Company, hard-eyed and broad across the chest, even by the measure of Astartes. The equatorial jungles glowed in lambent green on the southern reaches of the projection, a stain amid the ash and fire of war. Before the gathered officers, Bardane gave the words required of him. "We commit the chapter entire to the defense of Armageddon," he said. "We hold no life cheap that remains useful to the Emperor. We deny the beast. We deny the traitor. We deny the warp its harvest." A litany answer came from the captains in low unison. So sworn. Then Bardane dismissed all save Magar, Decario, Ilonus, and a chosen handful of officers and veterans. The doors sealed. The globe shifted. Battlefronts vanished. New lines appeared, converging not upon the hives, but upon the jungle belt, where old war scars ran beneath the canopy like half-healed knife wounds, Bardane looked to Magar. "You will take the fourth into the equatorial jungles. You will locate the object seen in trance and omen. You will answer all public summons only when doing so does not endanger the true objective." Magar's expression did not change. "By whose authority is this priority set?" "By mine," Bardane said. That was enough. Decario stepped forward and laid one gauntleted hand upon the edge of the tactical table. The jungle lumens guttered as though a cloud had passed across them. "There is a wound beneath that growth," the chief librarian said. "Not metaphor, not supposition. A place where rage was made shape and buried. The old war never truly scabbed over there. I have seen it in vision. I have heard it beneath the noise of this world's agony." "Angron's monolith," Magar said. Decario inclined his head once. Ilonus spoke for the first time, his voice as blunt as a hammer against armor. "If the world dies while we hunt stone in a swamp, history will name this betrayal." "History does not decide truth," Bardane replied. "Victory does." No man argued after that. Thus the Fourth Company descended into a second war hidden beneath the first. Captain Magar led from the front, as was his custom. Helm mag locked, scarred face exposed to the furnace reek of the planet, until the company crossed into the jungle belt, and the air changed from ash-dry ruin to wet rot thick enough to taste. At his side strode Codicier Ibraxin, younger than Decario, and less severe of countenance, though war had already carved much from him and left little but purpose. Sergeant Juster commanded one of the advance squads, a veteran with a voice like crushed rock and a habit of pausing before speech as though testing each word for weakness. Sergeant Devolio led the second line, broader and more openly contemptuous, a chainsword duelist whose gauntlets were permanently dark with old blood in the creases. Karen carried the squad vox and a heavy bolter. Nabori moved with the easy predatory quiet of a marksman. Cantus was a demolitions adept and breaker of sealed things. Baylock had once laughed often by Astartes' measure and now almost never did. Nochi Taran was the youngest among them in years of service, but no less deadly for that. The Thunderhawk skimmed low over the canopy and found no landing zones that were not already trying to kill them. Fungal spires rose through the trees like swollen knuckles. Vast leaves slapped at fuselages. Old anti-aircraft emplacements from some forgotten campaign lay buried in creepers and bone-coloured moss, their machine spirits either dead or maddened. Twice on the descent, they took desultory fire from feral orc nests hidden among the upper growth. Once a vine the thickness of a man's torso wrapped around a gunship's landing strut and had to be burned away by the door gunners while the pilots cursed over the Vox. When the company disembarked into the jungle, the first sensation was not danger. It was wrongness. The ground yielded too softly beneath ceramite boots, not like soil, but like flesh gone long dead. Wet heat pressed against armor seals. Insects battered themselves to paste against helm lenses and clouds. Rot pooled in hollows deep enough to swallow a man to the chest. Huge fungus fans thrust through the undergrowth in bruised colors, some weeping a luminous discharge that hissed when it touched plate. The smell was a thing in itself. Mold, stagnant water, fungal bloom, cordite from old wars buried in the mud. And beneath all of it, so faint that only transhuman senses marked it, a sour trace like dried blood left too long in sealed air. Ibraxin turned his helm slowly, as though listening to voices just beyond hearing. "This ground remembers," he said. Juster answered without looking back. "It remembers filth." Devolio gave a low snort over the squad channel. Then we tread where we are needed. Their route cut through jungle sectors nominally under imperial contest, though contest on Armageddon often meant only that neither side had yet fully consumed the other. Steel Legion survivors appeared more than once in the first days, stumbling through the undergrowth in soot-black greatcoats, respirators cracked, eyes gone wide and stupid from fear, heat, and lack of sleep. Some had fought orcs. Some had fled things in the jungle for which they had no names. Once they found civilians with them, perhaps labor evacuees from some convoy broken farther north, dragging children and wounded men through mud that reached the knee. They did not know what they had wandered into. The first such group froze when the Relictors emerged from the foliage around them in full warplate, bolters tracking, lenses red in the green dark. A Steel Legion lieutenant, his left sleeve tied off above a cauterized stump, tried to salute before remembering that one does not salute executioners. "My lords," he said, voice raw through the respirator grill. "There is an orc concentration 2 clicks east, and we have wounded. We were told Astartes were operating in this sector. We request escort to the northern line." Magar regarded him for one cold moment. "Denied," he said. The lieutenant stared. "My lord, there are civilians." "There are impediments," Magar corrected. "Withdraw west. Speak of this route to no one," a child began, sobbing behind the line of survivors.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The sound seemed monstrous in that place. The lieutenant looked from one helmet to the next and understood, or thought he did. His face tightened. "This is not a route to the northern line at all," he said. Juster raised his bolter a fraction. "Go," he said. They went. Not all were granted that mercy. On the 5th day, the advance squads encountered another cluster of survivors in the ruins of a jungle relay station. Men of the Steel Legion barricaded behind crates and broken antenna sections. 3 civilians among them, all of them having seen too much of the Relictors' search pattern and the marked ruins through which they passed. Devolio questioned them for less than a minute. Then, with Magar's tacit consent and Ibraxin's silence, the squad executed every one of them and burned the corpses beneath Promethean wash. Karen stood watch while the flames climbed. Nabori looked away only once, and only because there was movement in the trees. The jungle war deepened. Juster's squad advanced at the leading edge, cutting sign where no mortal scout could have read the ground. Feral orcs nested there in profusion, degenerate descendants of old spores and broken armies, smaller than frontline greenskins in some cases, but no less vicious. They favoured pits covered with woven leaves, sharpened stakes daubed in filth, snare cables strong enough to jerk a man upside down into thorn tangles packed with fungus rot. They shrieked from the undergrowth with crude spears and scrap guns, hurling themselves into close quarters where numbers and savagery might matter. Against the Relictors, such hope lasted only moments. Bolters tore the ambushes open in red sprays of meat and splintered bone. Chainswords bit through green necks and blackened tusks. Combat knives punched up beneath rib cages and out through spines. A feral knob bigger than the rest lunged from a root hollow at Juster with a hooked cleaver made from the blade of some ancient industrial saw. Juster let it strike his pauldron, stepped into the blow, and drove his gladius up through the thing's mouth until the point burst from the back of its skull in a fan of brains and broken fangs. "This world is not our charge," Taran voxed in the lull after the slaughter, his tone edged with a doubt he had not yet learned to hide completely. "We move as though every living soul here were already written off. Baelosh answered him before the sergeant could. All souls are written off, brother. Some simply take longer to read their sentence. Juster said nothing for several moments. Then he crouched by a crude totem the orcs had driven into the mud. It was made from welded scrap, teeth, and the skull of a guardsman caked in old grease. "We are not here for Armageddon," he said at last. The squad channel went still. Karen broke the silence. "We are where the captain set us." "That is not the same thing," Juster replied. He rose and put 2 shells through, the totem skull, blasting it into wet fragments. The first true blood price came at dusk beneath a canopy so dense the day died early. Juster's squad was picking its way along a rise of root-wrapped ground overlooking a black water basin when the orcs sprang the kill. Not a mob rush this time, an arranged ambush, crude mines buried in the mud, shooter fire crossing from both flanks, spear throwers hidden in fungal curtains. The first explosion went off beneath Nabori. One moment he was advancing in measured silence, stalker bolter up and scanning. The next, the ground erupted under him and he vanished in a burst of mud, shrapnel, and pulverized root. His lower body came apart in the blast. What remained of him struck a tree trunk hard enough to crack ceramite and slid down, leaving blood and organ matter on the bark. "Contact," Karen voxed needlessly, his heavy bolter already hammering. Juster turned and saw greenskin shapes boiling from the brush, while more buried charges winked, amber beneath the mud ahead. Nabori still lived for 3 heartbeats, perhaps 4. His hand clawed once at the ruin of his own torso, as if reaching for a weapon no longer there. Then his secondary heart burst through the shredded armor of his chest in a gout of red, and he sagged still. Cantus saw the mine run before the others did. "Hold," he barked. "Hold where you stand." Another feral pack was circling from the rear, driving them forward by instinct into the concealed explosives. Devolio's supporting unit was too far back to reach them in time. Ebraxin's wards flared somewhere through the trees as the Codicier fought his own battle against unseen pressure in the air. Juster turned to issue a fallback command. Cantus had already moved. He ran straight into the mined stretch, mag boots pounding the slick root mat, bolt pistol firing one-handed into the nearest charging orcs. 2 mines blew under him, shearing off one leg and opening his side. He did not fall. He dropped onto his remaining knee, reached forward with both gauntlets, and tore loose the concealed junction line feeding the rest of the trap grid. The detonation that followed consumed him. It also saved the squad. Mud, roots, blood, and broken orc bodies fountained into the air. The blast wave flattened the nearest attackers and triggered the remaining explosives in a chain that ripped a trench through the ambush line. Karen and Baeloch opened fire into the smoke. Taran waded into the survivors with chainsword revving, his blade spraying gobbets of green meat. Juster advanced at the center of it all, every movement stripped down to pure killing efficiency, smashing one feral orc's jaw apart with the butt of his bolter before shooting another through both eyes at muzzle press range. When the last of them were dead, nothing moved in the basin but drifting smoke and falling leaf matter. Juster went first to Nabori. There was almost nothing to recover. Then he went to the crater where Cantus had vanished. One hand remained, still locked around the broken detonator wire. Beyond it lay fragments of blackened ceramite, a strip of flayed flesh, and the lower half of a helm grinning up from the churned mud. Karen spoke in a low voice. He broke the trap with his body. He fulfilled his office, Juster said. Yet when he said it, even he heard the poverty of the words. They made camp that night in the shell of a bunker from some older war. its ferrocrete walls split by root growth and old impact scars. No one removed helm or plate. The jungle hissed outside in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rolled over the horizon from the main fronts, like the growl of a god too far away to care. Ibraxin entered near midnight, mud to the knee and his face pale beneath his psychic hood. "I have it," he said. Maega looked up from the map slate. "Speak." The Codicier's gaze drifted toward Justa's squad and the empty places where Nabori and Cantus should have been. "The pressure is stronger here," he said. "Not above, below. The old stain, the old rage. We are near enough now that it presses even through the wards." "How near?" Maega asked. Ibraxin placed one gauntleted finger on a section of ruined topography marked with broken survey sigils and old no-entry ciphers left over from forgotten campaigns. There. Justa studied the slate. The marked zone was no battlefield objective, no supply point, no command nexus. Merely an infected wedge of jungle and collapsed stonework where the cartography itself seemed hesitant. Baloch muttered, "More dead for buried secrets." Maega ignored him. He looked to Justa. "Can you reach it by dawn?" Justa's eyes lingered on the ruin marker, then on the blood still drying dark across his gauntlets. "We can reach anything, Captain," he said. "The matter is what waits when we do." Maega gave a single nod. "Then go and find it." By first light, what little of it filtered through the canopy, just as surviving. Advance elements were moving again. The jungle had changed. Even the insects seemed fewer. The ground sloped downward toward a basin of diseased growth, where the trees leaned inward as though trying to conceal whatever lay beneath them. Old stone protruded from the mud in geometric angles no jungle should have tolerated. Black surfaces flashed beneath the roots and vanished again. Here and there the earth had bulged upward in unnatural planes, not like buried rock, but like architecture trying to breathe under skin. Taran halted and made the sign of warding over his chest. Justa said nothing. He keyed the vox. His voice went out through the wet green dark to Maega, to Ibraxin, to the hidden command channels of the Fourth Company, and perhaps in some colder way to Bardane himself, far beyond the jungle war, and the billions dying honestly elsewhere upon Armageddon. "We have found the wound beneath the world." They entered the Purgatus zone at dawn, though dawn beneath the equatorial jungle was only a thinning of blackness into a greener shade of rot. The ground had changed in the hours since Justa's Vox report. It no longer felt like jungle earth beneath ceramite tread. It felt built, layered, pressed into hidden planes beneath the mud, as though some ancient geometry had lain buried there so long that root and fungus had grown over it like scar tissue over bone. The trees leaned wrong. Their trunks curved inward around the basin, where the pressure in the air was strongest. Not like living growth seeking light, but like witnesses flinching from something they had learned could not be named. The smell was wrong as well. No longer merely swamp, mold, and old war. There was blood in it now, dry and metallic, like the scent left inside a slaughter chamber long after the carcasses had been dragged away. Captain Maega led the advance with the Fourth Company spread in a tightening cordon around the basin. His stride never altered, though every auspex, sweep returned contradiction, and every few paces the magnetics in his greaves pulled at the ground as though iron moved below the mud. At his right moved Codicier Ibraxin, with 3 librarians from the attached command elements, psychic hoods alive with a pale electrical murmur. Behind them came Sergeant Devolio and the reserve line, his chainblade resting against one pauldron, teeth wet from the kill work of the previous day. Justa advanced at the leading edge with Karen, Baloch, and Nositarin, the empty places of Nabori and Cantus marching with them like mute ghosts. Inquisitor Halstron joined them at the last rally point before the basin. He came in the company of stormtroopers and 2 sanctioned adepts carrying seal cases and auger packs, all of them mud-splashed and hollow-eyed from the jungle. Halstron himself was a tall man, gone thin with years and obsession, his breastplate lacquered black, his inquisitorial sigil crusted with old grime, his face cut by the kind of lines that came from long habit of suspicion. He looked upon the assembled Relictors as one might look upon a chained grox bred for slaughter, with caution, with contempt, with the secret pride of the man convinced he still held the leash. "You will proceed only under my witness," he said to Magar. "This relic, if relic it proves to be, falls under the jurisdiction of the Holy Ordos." Magar regarded him in silence until the stormtroopers behind Halstron started to shift uneasily. "You are present, Captain," Halstron added, mistaking the silence for uncertainty. "That is sufficient." Decario arrived after him, walking down into the basin through curtains of hanging vine and spore mist, with the composure of a priest entering a chapel already prepared for sacrifice. His armor was stripped of every unneeded ornament. Only ward chains, hexagrammic seals, and the blackened psychic hood remained. He did not acknowledge Halstron at first. He lifted one gauntlet and let his fingers hover over the air as though feeling the breath from an unseen furnace. "It is here," he said. The basin floor sank toward a central rise of black stone pushing through the mud. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a buried ruin, one more shattered remnant from some forgotten campaign. Then the eye settled upon it and knew the lie. The structure was no ruin. It was too whole, too deliberate. A pyramid, if pyramid were the proper word for something that seemed to alter by fractions each time one looked away and then back again. Its lines refused comfort. Angles that should have met did not quite meet. Faces slick as obsidian caught no reflection, only the suggestion of movement beneath the surface, as though old storms were trapped within the stone. Roots had crawled over parts of it and then recoiled, blackened and dead. Around its base, the mud had hardened into dark, glassy sheets where no fire had touched. Angren's monolith was not merely seen, it was endured. Justa felt it, first as pressure behind the eyes, then as a low grinding anger under the breastbone, something ancient and titanic pressing at him through armor, gene-wrought flesh and discipline alike. He had known hatred in many forms, his own, the enemy's, the cold and useful hatred drilled into every battle brother from youth. This was different. This was hatred so large it ceased to be emotion and became weather. Karen's heavy bolter sagged by a finger's breadth before he corrected the lapse. Baloch muttered a curse in the battle cant of the chapter. Taran stared too long at one sloping face of the monolith, then snapped his helm away as though from a blow. Ibraxin spoke through clenched teeth. "Keep your thoughts nailed to doctrine. It seeks fracture." Halstron stepped closer despite the warning, eyes hungry now, all his earlier severity curdling into the avarice of the already compromised. He had told himself, perhaps for years, that he came to restrain the Relictors, to witness and contain, to ensure no line was crossed without record. Yet the monolith radiated the same poison that had ruined better men. Utility, possibility. The suggestion that only one more compromise was required, and then the weapon in the dark might finally be understood. "Can it be opened?" he asked. Decario turned to him then. "Everything may be opened, Inquisitor," he said. "The question is what survives the doing." The command elements spread around the monolith in concentric lines. Bardane himself had come down for the final approach, attended by Ilonus and his honor guard. The chapter master did not kneel and did not pray. He stood before the black geometry with one hand resting on the pommel of his sheathed blade and watched Decario begin the rite. The fragment lay embedded halfway up the southern face, though embedded suggested passivity, and there was nothing passive about it. It protruded from the black stone like a tooth from gum, half buried, jagged, iron dark, its exposed edge hooked and wicked and faintly wet, though nothing should have been wet there. The warp around it thickened and thinned by turns. Those with any psychic sensitivity could feel that the shard did not merely remain in the monolith, it fought to remain. Decario began the extraction with no wasted word. Hexagrammic anchors were driven into the mud around the pyramid. Ward chains uncoiled and were set in precise intervals. Ibraxin and the other librarians formed the inner ring, chanting in low monotone through vox grills as their hoods built a crackling crown of force over the site. The air turned leaden. Insects fell dead from the air. Halstron's stormtroopers began vomiting behind their rebreathers and had to be forced back by the honor guard. Juster felt something move through his thoughts. Not speech, not vision, clawing. Something vast and furious raking along the inner walls of his mind as though trying to find purchase. For one heartbeat he saw a sky split by brass fire and heard the endless bellow of a thing too enraged to die. Then the image was gone, leaving only blood in one nostril and his pulse hammering against the gorget seals. Decario set both hands upon the exposed shard. The monolith shuddered. Pulling it free was not like drawing metal from stone. It was like tearing a fang from the jaw of a sleeping beast. Every inch came with resistance that seemed to run not through matter, but through memory itself. The jungle darkened. The librarian's chant deepened. Ibraxin staggered once and vomited blood inside his helm before mastering himself. Halstron's adepts dropped to their knees, hands clawing at the earth. The pressure in the basin built and built until every battle brother present felt his teeth strain in the skull from clenching. Decario dragged the shard another finger's breadth free. The monolith screamed. No mortal throat made that sound. No machine could have replicated it. The scream tore through the basin and through the jungle and through the minds of every living thing within leagues. Vox systems burst into static and blood. Trees shook as if struck by orbital fire. Men far away on picket lines would later fall to their knees with both hands over their ears and never know why. It was the warp given voice and rage given command. Then the jungle answered. Orcs came in numbers no scout report had hinted at. Feral packs by the hundreds boiling from the undergrowth, then more behind them, then mobs massed so thick the foliage itself seemed to move. Drums boomed somewhere beyond sight. Crude horns blared. Shooters barked from every side. The basin became a cauldron of green flesh, rusted iron, and roaring animal hatred in an instant. Contact all arcs, Magar voxed, and the fourth company opened fire. Bolters hammered the jungle edge into sprays of leaf mulch, shattered tusk, and exploding skulls. Karen's heavy bolter cut swathes through the first charging line so brutally that torsos flew apart in ropes of offal and black-green blood. Devolio bellowed a target rune and drove his reserve squad into the eastern choke point, where a knot of bigger ferals had broken through the first volley. They hit him like a collapsing wall. Devolio killed the first three before their momentum even slowed, his chainsword biting through collarbones, rib cages, necks, chewing meat and spine into a hot slurry that fountained over his chest plate. Then a crude spear punched through the flex seal behind his knee. Another orc slammed a cleaver into his helm. A third leapt onto his back, hacking wildly with a rusted blade the size of a machete. Devolio kept killing, roaring curses through ruptured vox, stomping one greenskin's face into pulp, even as a chopper split his left arm to the elbow. When he finally went down, it was beneath a mound of bodies and his own blood, still sawing his chain blade in blind circles, until an orc drove a spike through his eye lens and into the brain behind. The line buckled. Justa saw it and moved without command, taking Karen, Balok and Taran into the narrowest approach, where root banks and broken black stone formed a natural choke. Orcs piled in 3 and 4 abreast, shrieking, firing from the hip, hurling sharpened scrap and fungus bombs that burst into choking yellow filth. Justa met them at blade reach. He fired until the bolter clicked dry, then used it as a club. He smashed one orc's jaw into fragments and drove his gladius through another's throat. Karen fired point blank over his shoulder, every shell turning heads into wet geysers and chests into bursts of steaming meat. Balok fought low and brutal, stabbing under ribs, sawing tendons, kicking bodies back into the press. Taran screamed litanies with a voice no longer wholly his own, and revved his chainsword through limbs, guts, and tusked faces alike. The pressure from the monolith never ceased. It clawed at discipline even as the orcs did. A mine or grenade burst near the choke, and Justa took the blast full across his right side. Armor split from shoulder to hip. Shards punched through the primary lung and into one of the secondary organs. He dropped to one knee, rose again, and kept fighting with blood pumping down the inside of his plate. "Hold," he growled over the squad channel. "Hold until stone and shard are clear." Behind them, Decario tore the fragment free. The moment it came loose, the scream changed. The monolith seemed to exhale decades of old murder in one pulse. The shard in Decario's hands bled shadow. Ibraxin cried out as something raked across his mind hard enough to drop him. 2 of the librarians collapsed, writhing. Halstron fell backward into the mud, one hand over his face, shrieking prayers to a god he had thought himself mature enough to negotiate on practical terms. Taran broke. He froze in the middle of the kill work and turned slowly toward Balosh, helm tilted, chainblade idling in his hands. "Brother," Balok said, breath harsh over the channel. "Look at me." Taran's reply came in a voice full of static and distant laughter. "He is beneath the stone." Then he attacked. The chainsword hit Balok's breastplate in a scream of sparks and chewing teeth. Balok blocked the second blow with his forearm, and the weapon bit through ceramite, bone, and muscle to lock half buried in the limb. Karen started to turn, but an orc dragged him back into the melee. Justa lunged to intervene and nearly blacked out as his ruined side tore wider open. Balok wrestled Taran bodily, trying to pin him, trying not to kill his own brother, trying still to speak sense over a mind already drowned. Taran headbutted him once, twice, then drove a combat blade up under Balok's gorget. The point burst from the back of Balok's neck in a red fan. Balok sagged, both hands still clutching at his brother's wrists, as if even dying he meant to restrain rather than condemn. Justa reached them a heartbeat too late. He put his gladius through Taran's throat, dragged it sideways, and tore the whole front of the younger warrior's neck open. Blood sprayed in hot arterial sheets across the roots and black stone. Taran fell twitching beside Balok, their blood mingling in the mud. For one fractured instant, the squad stood amid brothers and greenskins both, and the jungle around them felt less like a battlefield than a pit where sanity itself had been butchered. Then Bardain unleashed the vault. He had held back until that moment, perhaps from caution, perhaps from the old instinct to preserve appearances before Halstron and the surviving observers. No longer. Ilona strode to his side with a black-bladed gladius drawn. The honor guard opened lock caskets brought down under shroud cloth. A censer of chained brass swung from one veteran's fist, spilling not smoke, but red vapor that burned the eyes and made the nearest orcs claw at their own faces. Another brother activated a hooked flail whose links moved with serpentine malice, each strike shearing through multiple bodies and leaving the wounds blackened as if gnawed from within. Bardain himself took up a scourge bound in scripture and iron nails, and when he cast it into the charging greenskins, the weapon cracked with a sound like flayed souls, bursting torsos, stripping flesh from bone, and sending mobs reeling in sudden animal terror. The Relictors ceased to look like loyalist Astartes then. They looked like armoured execution spirits dragging chained hell behind them in service to a throne far above mercy. Even the orcs faltered. Magar saw the opening and made his choice without visible hesitation. A squad of Steel Legion survivors had stumbled into the basin from the northern slope, drawn by the scream, their officer shouting for identification and aid, while his men tried to form a firing line against the oncoming greenskin tide. With them were 2 imperial observers. From Sector Command, picked recorders still slung across their chests. If they survived, they would speak. If they spoke, the secret was gone. "Captain," Karen voxed, half buried in shell smoke, "the mortals are in the kill lane." Magar did not look toward them. "Secure the fragment. Withdraw on my mark." "They will be overrun," Ibraxin said, blood sheeted across his lower face. Magar turned his helm toward the codicier, and whatever Ibraxin saw there was enough to still him. The Steel Legion line died where it stood. Orcs crashed into them and tore them apart in sprays of blood, mud, and cloth. One observer ran toward the Relictors, waving an identification seal. A feral knob hit him from the side hard enough to pulp his spine and throw his upper body into a root mass 10 meters away. Another guardsman reached the perimeter and screamed for extraction until a thrown axe buried itself in his head and split it to the teeth. The Relictors did not move to save any of them. Their perimeter contracted around Decario and the Shard. By the time the last withdrawal charges were set, and the monolith basin became a storm of promethium, bolter fire, and collapsing root banks, the 4th Company had been reduced by blood and madness to a hard core of survivors limping through the jungle with the relic bound inside a hexagrammic coffin. Juster was carried for part of the retreat and walked for the rest because he refused the indignity of stillness. His armor leaked blood from a dozen breaks. Devolio lay somewhere behind in pieces beneath the green dead. Balok and Tarin were both left to burn where they had fallen. Nabori and Cantus had gone ahead of them into the role of honored dead. When the Thunderhawks finally lifted from the jungle and clawed for the polluted sky, Armageddon still burned in every direction. Hive stacks belched flame into storm clouds. Distant batteries stitched the horizon with orange teeth. Armor wars crawled across the ash wastes, and whole populations died without ever knowing what had been taken from the planet beneath their agony. Within the hold of Magar's gunship, the fragment rested in chains etched with wards and sealed under layered black cloth. No one looked at it for long. The wounded groaned. The dead were tagged. Halstron sat against the hull with his eyes open and unseeing, as if some private certainty had been gutted inside him and left to bleed out. Magar stood over the coffin and said nothing. He did not need to. All of them understood by then, whether they approved or not, whether they had strength left to name it or not. The Relictors had not come to Armageddon to save a world. They had come to rob its grave. The shard was brought into the apothecarian vaults under prayer, circuitry, and lies. No common deck rating saw it. No servitor was permitted to record its transit. The wounded from the monolith basin were cleared from the corridor arteries first, their shattered armor and blood, glazed helms borne towards surgery vaults, while the chosen brethren stood watch in absolute silence. Then the hexagrammic coffin came through, slung on grav braces, chained in black iron, draped beneath seal cloths, stained dark where no stain should have been. Severian met it at the inner gate. The apothecarian had always been a place of cold labour and necessary desecration, where gene-wrought organs were harvested from the dead with reverence, where brothers were cut open to preserve brotherhood, where purity was measured in tissue density, gland integrity, and the faithful functioning of flesh made holy through suffering. Now another character had entered those halls. Not holiness, not yet open blasphemy, something between. The lumen strips had been dimmed. Cogitator banks throbbed under woven scripts of warding. Incense braziers burned beside Auspex pylons. Servo arms bearing sanctified scalpels shared alcoves with lock caskets, silver wards, and psychic null rods borrowed from the deepest reliquaries. A man entering that chamber would not have known whether he had stepped into a theatre of medicine, a ritual crypt, or the inside of a lie too elaborate to collapse cleanly. Decario stood waiting beside the slab where the coffin was to be opened. His armour was unmarked by the jungle retreat, save for dried blood in the joints and a fresh scorch line across one greave. The years had made him spare in motion and severe in countenance, yet there was more than severity in him now. There was consecration of a darker kind. He looked upon the coffin not as a physician might regard disease, nor as a priest might regard corruption, but as a man looks upon a key he has bled to obtain. "Open it," he said. Severian keyed the seal sequence. The cloth was drawn back first, then the outer locks. As the chains slackened, every lumen globe in the chamber guttered low and held there. The shard lay nestled in the coffin cradle on a bed of ward parchment and null filament. Up, close, it resembled no mere broken weapon fragment. It was a hooked fang of iron dark matter, jagged at the root, slick along the exposed edge, and blacker than metal had any right to be. It seemed to drink the light falling upon it and return only the idea of a reflection. A wounded veteran strapped to the nearest Medicae frame began choking out words through a split grill. "Get it from me," he rasped. "It is still in the skull. It is still in the skull." Another battle brother farther down the chamber had to be held by mag restraints while he recited the same half sentence again and again in a voice ruined by blood loss. "Beneath the stone, beneath the stone, beneath the stone." Severian had heard confessions before. Battle shock among Astartes was rare and ugly when it came. The survivors from the basin were not merely shaken. Something had reached into them and left finger marks in the soul. He turned from the wounded and brought up the hidden archives he had not yet dared to speak aloud in full before the chapter master. Gene scans bloomed over the slab in pale hololithic strands. Tissue readings from the dead of old campaigns. Progenoid harvests from brothers long interred. Metabolic response patterns. Osmodular drift. Catalepsian irregularities. Betcher gland deviations so minute no lesser apothecary would have marked them. Layer upon layer of evidence, each piece insignificant alone, each accumulation impossible to dismiss. Decario watched the display with hooded eyes. "You have delayed this for years," he said. "I have preserved this for years," Severian replied. That earned him the barest flicker of regard. Around them, the Medici servitors withdrew and the final privacy seals engaged. Beyond those locked doors, the fortress still orbited a world drowning in war. Vox petitions from Armageddon Command clamoured unanswered, or received only the clipped and partial response of captains already preparing departure vectors. Within the vault there, remained only the shard, the wounded, the hidden records, and the two men most responsible for understanding what the chapter had become. Severian magnified the diagnostic stream until the contradiction became unavoidable. "Here," he said. Decario stepped closer. "The pattern does not hold to single lineage expression," Severian said. "Not in the whole, not over time. Certain brothers carry response signatures that suggest one inherited suite. Others display another. Yet all remain viable. All remain combat capable. All remain within sacred function. The line does not fail. It divides and rejoins. It scars over and persists. Say it plainly," Decario said. Severian's jaw tightened. "Our gene line does not track cleanly to one Primarch source. Even speaking it aloud felt like a sin that should have drawn lightning from the deck." Decario did not recoil. Severian continued, because to stop now would have been cowardice. Whether the cause is contamination, deliberate hybridization, or some buried Mechanicus intervention lost to sealed record, I cannot yet prove. But the blood is not simple. It carries a duality. The monolith shard reacted to that duality. I saw it in the Medici streams from the basin survivors. The pressure it exerted did not strike uniformly. It bit more deeply where the contradiction in the line expressed most strongly. One of the wounded brothers on the slab beside them gave a strangled laugh that became a cough of bloody foam. "Two voices," he whispered. It sounded like two voices beneath one helm. Severian did not look at him. "This is a flaw," he said. "Perhaps old, perhaps crafted, perhaps inflicted, but a flaw nonetheless. One day it may break us from within." Decario laid one gauntleted finger beside the hololithic strands, and for a moment the display swam in the cold blue light of his hood. "Or it has preserved us," he said. Severian stared at him. "Most men who touch what we have touched become ash within themselves," Decario went on. "They rot swiftly. They prostrate themselves before the whisper. Yet our brethren endure longer than reason allows. The shard itself did not merely assail us. It answered something already present. Not weakness. Capacity. Capacity for corruption," Severian said. "Capacity for endurance," Decario replied. "Capacity for command." He turned his gaze upon the shard. "You call it a curse because you fear what the answer implies. I fear what the evidence implies," Severian said. "There is a difference." Decario's voice lowered, priest-like now, stripped of all ornament. "Then hear the evidence in full. We are not merely fortunate. We are fitted. That hidden duality in the blood, whether born of accident or ancient design, may be the very reason our chapter can walk nearer the precipice than others and not fall at once into the abyss. What would damn another brotherhood can be borne by ours, not forever. Nothing mortal is forever, but long enough, far enough, deep enough to do what others will not." Severian looked again at the shard and hated that some part of him understood the temptation in the argument. When Bardane was summoned, he came with Ilonus and the silence of men already prepared to accept any truth that increased their usefulness. The chapter master heard Severian's findings without interruption. He stood before the slab with his scarred face half in shadow, one hand resting lightly against the newly sanctified lock casket that contained the Artecus scourge. Ilonus stood at his shoulder, black-bladed gladius sheathed but close to hand. his expression unreadable as old stone. When Severian had finished, the chamber held its breath. At last, Bardane spoke. "You have named this a curse." "As an internal hypothesis only," Severian replied. "Not certainty. Not yet." Bardane's gaze shifted to the shard, then to Dicario. "And you, librarian, name it fitness." "I name it explanation," Dicario said. Bardane gave a single nod, as though some private equation had resolved in his mind. "Then we proceed." Severian felt sudden anger rise in him. "If it is a flaw," he said, "it may consume us." "If it is a weapon," Bardane answered, "it may preserve worlds. I will spend my chapter before I permit ignorance to spend the Imperium in its place." There it was, the truth that had always sat beneath every compromise. Not temptation, not fascination alone. License. He had wanted this answer long before the data gave him reason to want it. Bardane stepped closer to the slab and looked down into the coffin cradle, where the shard lay coiled in its own blackness. "We were never promised purity as an end in itself," he said. "We were made for war. If the blood in us is stranger than other blood, then let it be strange in the Emperor's service." Ilonus lowered his head once, a warrior's assent. Orders followed with brutal speed. The deeper reliquary decks were open to a chosen circle of veterans whose names had already been tested against obedience, endurance, and silence. New lock sigils were impressed into command gauntlets. Hidden cages were unsealed. The black-bladed gladius passed formally into Ilonus's keeping and was entered into no common inventory. Bardane took up the Arteca's scourge openly among the inner command, no longer as a battlefield expedient to be hidden after the fact, but as a sanctioned instrument within the doctrine now hardening around him. Selected sergeants were permitted to witness the relic litanies, others were not. The chapter was dividing inwardly into those who merely fought and those who would be trusted to wield the chained dark. No liturgy named them such, yet the truth was plain. They were becoming a cult within their own chapter. Armageddon Command learned of their intent to depart before the final rite was complete. The first vox from the planetary theatre marshal came shrilling into the strategium in clipped, furious bursts. Reinforcement requests denied. Drop support withdrawn. Hive. Sectors left without promised Astartes relief. Accusations of dereliction rose to the level of formal censure before the day was out. By the second watch, the tone had grown uglier. Oath breakers, grave robbers, faithless opportunists. Other imperial commanders added their voices, some with fury, some with bitter vindication, as though they had long expected this from the grey armoured predators who always seemed to hear a different call than the rest of the war. Bardane answered none of them directly. To his captains he said only, "There are wars beneath wars. Let mortals keep count of the obvious ones." The librarians were struck that same night. It began in the innermost sanctum as a pulse through every psychic ward aboard the Star Fort. Hood circuits flared. Null rods hummed and split their casings. Astropaths in distant choir chambers screamed and clutched at eyes suddenly running blood. Dicario, Ibraxen, and every battle psyker in the chapter convulsed where they stood or knelt. Some dropped senseless. Others remained upright by will alone, hands clawing into the iron rails of the sanctum as the vision tore through them. A lidless eye, vast beyond proportion, suspended in darkness that was not darkness but the interior of some cosmic wound, and from that unblinking eye there flowed blood. Not tears as men understood tears, but long arterial streams pouring down into a gulf of storm and fire. Dicario came out of the vision on one knee, his face blooded from the nose, his pupils blown wide. "The Eye of Terror," he said. Ibraxin, shaking, could only nod. Bardain did not ask whether the vision might be false. That stage of uncertainty had long passed. Fleet orders changed within the hour. Armageddon was left behind beneath its smoke and screams, while the Relictors' star fort turned toward the greater darkness. Men cursed them for it. Imperial officers sent formal condemnations. One admiral of the Navy swore over open vox that he would remember the name Relictors as long as he lived and teach his heirs to spit after speaking it. Steel Legion commanders whose regiments had expected Astartes' reinforcement called them carrion lords and oathless hounds. The messages were archived or deleted according to rank. None altered course. The Eye awaited. The first proving of the new doctrine came not long after translation into the marches of the Great Warp Wound, on a blighted moon circling a dead giant, where a word-bearer's host had raised a fortress shrine from old mineworks and captive bone. Conventional imperial assaults had already failed there. Guard regiments had been broken in the approach trenches. Naval bombardment had only driven the enemy deeper underground. The shrine's outer curtain was warded by profane sigils that turned artillery aside and fed upon the fear of prisoners packed alive behind the walls. Bardain chose that target precisely because conventional war had failed. The assault descended in black silence. Thunderhawks dropped into crater fields slick with old gore and fresh ash. Assault ramps crashed down. Grey armoured forms advanced through shell smoke beneath no banners and no songs. This time, there was no pretense before outsiders. The Chosen bore relics openly beneath cowl cloths and chain wraps. Ilonus moved with the black gladius drawn, its edge drinking the light around it. Bardain carried the Articus scourge in his right hand and a stormbolter in the left. Decario and the librarians advanced behind a veil of ward force so taut the air around them keened. At the outer trench line, the first captives were used. A rusted censer taken from a demon priest was swung over the parapet, spilling red smoke into the galleries below. Men hidden there came clawing out of bunkers, shrieking not in madness, but in revelation, their false skins blistering away as possession bloomed in the fumes. Relictor bolters cut them down in disciplined volleys. Ilonus went over the trench lip and into handwork, the black gladius sliding through throats, eye sockets, and joints in a chain of clinical murder. Where it struck, wounds blackened at once. The breach into the shrine proper was made by psychic assault and relic force in concert. Decario broke the first sigil wall with a cry that burst blood vessels in mortal ears. Bardain cast the scourge into the packed defenders at the breach, and the demon faces within it screamed as they fed, ripping men into gobbets and strips, lashing limbs from torsos, tearing the courage from all who saw it work. Behind him, the fourth company advanced through the opening like an iron wedge, boots slipping in entrails and blood as they smashed their way room by room through galleries of scripture written on flayed skin. The word-bearers fought like fanatics possessed by certainty. The Relictors fought like men who no longer required innocence. By the time the fortress shrine fell, the moon's surface had been turned into a charnel slope of black smoke, broken masonry, and corpse heaps dense enough to alter the contours of the ground. The enemy was annihilated. Their prisoners were liberated only long enough to be judged. Those who had heard too much, seen too much, or borne too much taint were lined against the inner wall and shot. Surviving imperial militia who had witnessed the relic work were gathered under pretext of debrief and never emerged from the lower galleries. Decario ordered all records seized. Servitors carrying battlefield pict feeds were disassembled. Data looms were burned. Even the dead were mutilated beyond recognition, where battlefield evidence might have suggested what weapons had truly broken the shrine. Success had become sufficient in itself. Righteousness was now an administrative burden to be managed after the killing was done. When the chapter returned to its star fort, the decks felt changed again. Not louder, not more disorderly, more settled, which was worse, as though a decision long debated had finally crossed into custom. Brothers knelt before the Emperor's altars still. Chaplains still roared the old catechisms. Gene seed was still harvested with all due reverence. Yet around and beneath those familiar observances ran another current, colder and harder than faith alone. Strength of will, courage of will, mastery through endurance, damnation gripped and made to serve. Severian walked the apothecarian passages in the wake of the victorious companies and saw it in their faces. Not corruption fully flowered, not yet. Something subtler, men already condemned in their own estimation and therefore freed from the need to appear blameless. Men who believed they had accepted a burden too heavy for lesser souls and so had begun to mistake self-accusation for sanctity. The chapter still swore loyalty to the Emperor. They meant it. That was the bleakest truth of all, for they no longer moved through the galaxy as sons hoping to remain pure beneath his gaze. They moved like executioners already blackened by the work, convinced that the stain was not a failing, but the necessary tax levied upon real victory. And because they believed that, they could carry hell farther than any openly damned foe ever would. By the time the end came for them, the Relictors had ceased to look like a chapter at war and begun to resemble a wandering reliquary of sharpened sins. They still bore the Emperor upon their tongues. They still cut down traitor and demon in his name. They still harvested gene seed from the dead with all the old reverence, still marked their fallen in the rolls of honor, still knelt before altars of iron and ash to recite the catechisms of battle before translation into the dark. Yet the men who did these things were no longer the sons who had once left Neutra in chains of duty and proud silence. They were relic-armed, hollow-eyed, inward turned, and hunted by the very empire they insisted they served. The 13th Black Crusade had widened around them like a galactic wound. Cadia bled. The marches around the Eye drowned in fleet actions, shrine burnings, and planetary slaughters too vast for any tally to hold. In those wars, the Relictors fought with a hatred no less sincere than any loyal son of the Imperium, but they did so according to purposes no Imperial command could trust. They struck word-bearers on poisoned moons and Night Lords in dead station labyrinths. They descended upon Xenos raiders, when doing so opened routes toward older vaults and buried texts. They refused common battle plans, whenever a darker objective beckoned beneath the obvious one. Every campaign yielded another shard, another text, another whispering instrument taken under seal. Then came Framus. The agri-world should have meant nothing in the scale of the Crusade. A world of grain belts, mountain vaults, and weather engines beneath skies too broad for comfort. Yet within one mountain there lay the Diomedes archive, a sealed chamber, kept hidden by the Ordo Malleus and guarded in secrecy against both traitor and loyal eye. The Relictors learned of it through the bound murmurings of one of their demon blades, and descended not as petitioners, but as takers. They broke the Imperial Guard upon the outer approaches, crossed the forbidden threshold, seized the artifact at the heart of the vault, and carried it from the mountain in a stasis chest, while blood from slain Imperial defenders froze black in the wind. That act ended all ambiguity. What had once been suspicion became sentence. What had once been censure became extermination. In a chamber of polished black stone, deep inside an inquisitorial flagship, Ciaro spoke the words that would kill a chapter. He was not a theatrical man. The years had burned all flourish from him and left only function. His armor was severe black, worked with silver scripture and the sigil of the holy ordos. One side of his face was corded by old burn scars, the flesh drawn tight around an augmetic eye that glowed a dim funeral red. Before him stood the warriors who would deliver the verdict, silver-armored giants marked with wards and names that no common imperial citizen would ever hear spoken aloud. Grey Knights. There were no banners in that chamber, no acclamation, no rage. Ciaro looked from one death-pale helm to the next and spoke as though dictating surgical instruction. "This is not vengeance," he said. "Leave vengeance to lesser men. This is excision." A chapter of the Adeptus Astartes has crossed from radical error into unforgivable contamination. They have killed the Emperor's servants to preserve prescribed relics. They have elevated forbidden practice to doctrine. They have made themselves a vessel through which corruption may pass under the sign of duty. Such things are not corrected. They are cut out. The Justicar at the fore inclined his head once. Name the target. Ciaro touched a rune, and the hololithic image of the Relictors' star, fort turned in the air above the chamber. Vast, bastioned, old beyond comfort. A void fortress built not merely to house war, but to survive the extinction of lesser fleets around it. They call it their sky fortress, Ciaro said. Today, it becomes their tomb. Within the star fort, Severian felt the first tremor of doom before the augurs named it. He was in the gene crypts below the apothecarian, sealing fresh caches recovered from Framus. The stasis chest taken from the archive stood behind triple wards, under the watch of servitors who had been blinded and lobotomized, rather than trusted with the memory of what they guarded. Around it lay shelves of bone caskets, tissue logs, progenoid stores, and the dead whose gene inheritance would outlive their flesh if the chapter survived the coming years. If. That word had begun to stalk his thoughts more often now. He keyed open a data slate and let old contradictions bloom once more before his eyes. Hormonal drift, organ response, variances. The double expression that had haunted him across decades of harvests and battlefield recoveries. Evidence of a bloodline that did not resolve cleanly into the certainty the chapter pretended it possessed. Yet even now, standing beneath the weight of old dead and older lies, he could no longer say with full conviction whether the anomaly preceded the chapter's descent, or whether years of proximity to warp taint had taught him to see significance where none had ever existed. Mixed gene seed curse. The phrase had spread inwardly by degrees, first as whispered hypothesis, then as covert doctrine, then as the secret pride of men who needed a reason to believe themselves chosen, rather than merely compromised. Severian stared at the readings, and for the first time allowed the unthinkable fully into speech inside his own skull. What if there had never been a curse at all? What if the blood was scarred, yes, or irregular, or partly tampered with in some age of Mechanicus? Arrogance, and yet none of that had ordained the path the chapter took. What if the Relictors had made a myth of their own uncertainty because they desired permission more than truth? What if the strange resilience Decario praised had never been divine appointment or genetic singularity, but only the slower damnation of men too proud to kneel before the evidence of their own appetite? The thought felt like sacrilege and honesty at once. Then the alarms began. Not one alarm, hundreds. Augur shrieks, shield impact runes, breach warnings, vox calls colliding over one another in the command channels until language itself became a torrent of clipped violence. The deck trembled under the first long-range bombardment. Dust rained from arching ceilings. Somewhere above, void shields caught the opening salvos and screamed their displeasure through the fortress bones like animals being flayed alive. Severian closed the data slate. The siege had come. The first bombardment lasted less than a minute and tore the outer sensor lattices into fire. The second broke one of the lesser shield projectors. The third came with boarding torpedoes. From the command bastion, Bardane watched the void around the star fort fill with the majesty of his own destruction. Inquisitorial battleships held range beyond the immediate defensive envelope, their gun batteries pounding in disciplined sequence. Escorts and strike cruisers cut through the debris field under overlapping screens of fire. Torpedoes, black and cruel and purposeful, burned inward on attack vectors aimed at armor seams and bastion spines, long known only to men who had studied the fortress for its weaknesses. So the Inquisition had prepared thoroughly. Good, Bardane thought. Better that the final proving be worthy. Ilonus stood beside him with the black gladius already drawn, its edge swallowing the strategium light. Decario occupied the lower step beneath the command throne, eyes closed, mind ranging outward, through the psychic static of battle like a predator scenting blood in a storm. Ciaro comes, the librarian said. Bardane did not ask how he knew. Then let him earn the verdict. The first torpedo struck the western bastion and punched through 6 armoured decks before the melter cores went up. Men and servitors and the dead, entombed in memorial alcoves, were vaporized together in a white bloom that split bulkheads and hurled atmosphere into the void. The second hit the reliquary spine and failed to penetrate cleanly, lodging half through the hull before detonating. Whole corridors became screaming chimneys of decompression. Ceramite helmets ripped from unsecured hands spun end over end into blackness beside blood globes, scripture scrolls, and fragments of men. The grey knights boarded through the smoke. They came in silver plate chased with ward sigils, every one of them a fortress of discipline, every one of them a living denial of the warp. Stormbolters spoke in surgical bursts. Nemesis blades flashed blue-white in the emergency lumens. Where the Relictors fought like men willing to chain darkness to their wrists, the Grey Knights fought like an answer written before temptation had even been posed. They advanced without roar, without hate wasted on theatrics, and the force of their refusal struck almost as hard as their weapons. At the first breach hall, Sergeant Harcus of the Honor Guard led the countercharge. He hit them with relic-bearing veterans at his back, a censer spilling bloody mist in one fist, power mace in the other, and for a moment the corridor became a collision of incompatible certainties. Grey Knight warding burned through the red vapour. A Relictor flail of hooked black links sheared a silver helm open and flung half a face into the bulkhead. Nemesis halberds answered, pulping torsos, punching through ceramite breastplates, breaking the hearts within. One Grey Knight took a demon axe to the shoulder, lost the arm, and still drove his blade through the attacker's skull a heartbeat later. Harcus died with half his chest torn away, trying to drag a Justicar down with him into vacuum through a fractured view slit. His death bought 2 minutes. Elsewhere in the fort, the relic vaults buckled. Bardane gave the order himself. Open every vault. Ilonus turned his head. Even now, my lord. Especially now, Bardane said. If we die proving what we learned. The lockrights spread down the hidden decks. Sigils disengaged. Chain cages opened. Stasis fields died in rows. Weapons that should never have endured within loyal walls breathed the air again. Helms exhaled frost. Bound blades woke in their sheaths. Sensors began to drip fresh blood from old brass. The chest from Framus pulsed once beneath its seals, as if hearing the order and approving. There was madness in the command. Yes, there was certainty as well. The battle became a mirror match rendered through opposite blasphemies. Both chapters were warrior mystics. Both had endured the touch of the warp and lived. Both knew that demonic force could not be answered by mere steel alone. Yet where the Grey Knights believed mastery began with refusal, with warding, with the uncompromised annihilation of every foothold, the Relictors had come to believe mastery began with seizure, with harness, with the ruthless conviction that the claw may be ripped from the beast and made to tear its own throat. They were reflections that hated what they saw. In the lower gene crypts, Severian armed himself not for glory, but for salvage. He gathered his apothecaries and ordered the old caches prepared for emergency transit. Gene seed caskets, tissue logs, identity rolls of the dead. Whatever remained of the chapter's future now fit into a handful of stasis canisters and wrapped memory cores. Around him, the crypt walls shook with each fresh impact. Above, men died by the 100. He took one last look at the concealed data casket he had hidden years before. The truth of the bloodline lay within it, or something like truth. Enough evidence to damn the chapter more completely. Enough uncertainty to preserve doubt forever. He took it with him. Then the breach came to the crypt doors. Grey Knights cut through the outer seals in a white lance wash, and Severian met them in the threshold amid shelves of the dead. His Narthesium flashed. Reductor barked. One silver warrior took a point blank, burst through the visor and stumbled, though not far. Another split Apothecary Darren from throat to groin with a halberd strike that sprayed both gene caskets and wall shrines with blood and organs. Severian drove his chain blade into the gap beneath a Grey Knight's pauldron and felt the teeth bite deep. But the silver warrior answered by smashing him across the jaw hard enough to crack bone under the armor seals. They fought among the honored dead until the shelves toppled and caskets burst open across the deck in tumbling ivory. And red. Severian killed one. He lost count of how many of his own died. When Ilonus arrived with the honor guard, the crypt floor was already ankle-deep in blood and shattered bone. The black gladius moved through the chamber in strokes too efficient to be called wild, each thrust opening a fatal dark wound, each slash blackening silver armor with some deeper poison. A Grey Knight champion met Ilonus in the center of the crypt. Nemesis soared against demon-edged gladius, and the sound of their clash was like a cracked chapel bell struck underwater. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Ilonus slew him at the cost of his left eye and half his throat. He stood afterwards spraying blood down the front of his plate and only said, "Move the gene seed." Severian obeyed. Deck by deck the star fort died. Void shields failed in rippling collapse. Gun bastions were gutted. Boarding actions multiplied until the fortress no longer contained a battle, but 100 discreet butcheries under failing grav plates and burst lumen strips. In the reliquary galleries, ruptured cages spilled demonic backlash into packed melee. One chained helm split open and disgorged a face made of smoke and flensed skin that wrapped itself around a Grey Knight and a Relictor alike, melting both into one screaming knot before the nearby brothers blew them apart. A brass censer burst and filled an entire transept with red fog through which bodies hacked one another into ruin at arm's reach, half blind and choking. In one memorial nave, a nemesis hammer caved in Bardane's veteran Parvel from crown to pelvis so completely that his organs burst from the seams of his armor and froze on the deck in the sucking cold of a hull breach. Along the outer gun deck, a whole squad of Relictors was blown into the void when decompression ripped the bulkhead apart, their blood freezing in branching fans across the remaining wall before drifting off into blackness. The gore became cathedral scale, heads pulped beneath force weapons, ceramite split and peeled away with the flesh beneath it, men disemboweled by chain teeth and then flash frozen in the wash of broken atmosphere, organs boiling in vacuum shock, teeth and eyes suspended in crimson spheres that drifted through chapel aisles lit only by emergency strobes and the intermittent blue glare of psychic discharge. In the heart of it, Ciaro came aboard. He entered through the central breach with his retinue and a squad of grey knights at his back, walking into the ruins of the command spine as if into a surgical chamber. Bodies lay everywhere, silver and grey and mortal alike, all reduced to equal meat in the end. He stepped over them with the patience of a man approaching a disease long studied and finally ready to excise. Bardane awaited him before the shattered command throne. The chapter master was wounded in a dozen places. His right pauldron hung in shards. Blood ran from the seals at his thigh and neck. The saw, Arteka's scourge, coiled black and red in his fist, like something alive and eager. Beside him stood Decario, beneath a storm of failing ward runes, and Ilonus, one eye ruined, black gladius slick to the hilt. Ciaro took in the scene, and his voice held no triumph. This did not have to end here. Bardane's laugh was a sound without mirth. It always ended here, Inquisitor. You simply lacked the courage to name the path. I named it correctly, Ciaro said. Heresy disguised as utility. Then come test the disguise, Bardane replied. The last battle of the Relictors' command cadre began beneath the corpse light of a dying star fort. Grey knights crashed into honor guard. Nemesis blades rang against relic steel. Psychic force hammered the chamber hard enough to crack the floor. Decario met the Grey Knight librarian in a duel of wills that turned the air to acid and made mortal attendants burst at the eyes and ears. Ilonus killed 2 more silver warriors before a halberd took him, through the abdomen, and pinned him for a heartbeat to the cracked command stair. He tore himself free, spilling loops of intestine across the stone, and kept fighting until a second blow severed his sword arm at the shoulder. Still, he tried to bite at the man who killed him. Bardane reached Ciaro through all of it. The scourge struck first and split the Inquisitor's retinue apart in sprays of blood and armor shards. Ciaro answered with a psycannon burst that blew one side of Bardane's cuirass open and shattered 2 ribs beneath. They closed anyway. Scourge against wardstaff. Transhuman fury against human conviction armored in rank and hatred. Bardane fought like a man who had surrendered any claim to innocence years before and now demanded only proof. Ciaro fought like a man who had buried pity beneath duty and would never exhume it again. Severian saw little of that end directly. He was already on the evacuation route, dragging gene caskets and the half-dead through. Smoke choked passages toward the remaining strikecraft bays. Yet later, in memory, he always pictured Bardane standing in the ruin beneath dead lumens and failing stars, still insisting by the motion of his body alone that all the blood spent had meant something more than appetite. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps it was one final lie. The survivors did not win the battle. They won only escape. Under cover of a magazine detonation triggered by Decario's final psychic collapse, a cluster of thunderhawks and assault boats smashed through the inquisitorial cordon. Hulls burned, engines screamed, escorts died around them. One craft took a lance graze and split in half, tumbling its dead and living alike into the void. Another made translation with no one left conscious at the controls, save a mortally wounded helmsman whose hands had fused to the yoke. A few hundred escaped. No more. They carried with them gene seed caches, relic fragments, bone caskets of their dead, half-burned, logs, sealed weapons, and a stasis chest whose contents no longer belonged to any lawful record of mankind. Severian came among them, blood-soaked and half-blind, clutching the old data casket to his chestplate, as though in that small black box some answer still waited to redeem the ruin around him. It did not. As the surviving craft turned toward the Eye of Terror, he opened the casket one final time and let the old contradictions shine across his visor. Dual expression, scarred lineage, hidden tampering, possible contamination. 100 ways to phrase uncertainty and make it sound like fate. He stared until the runes blurred red through his own blood. Was the chapter's blood truly mixed? Had that secret singularity made them able to bear what others could not? Or had the notion of a curse become merely the story they told themselves so they could grip demonic steel without admitting desire? No answer came, only the dark ahead. Behind them, the Imperium wrote its verdict, in cold formal lines. Excommunicate Traitoris, Extremis Diabolus, names struck from honor rolls, histories revised, a chapter reduced to warning. Behind them, the Grey Knights counted the Purge incomplete and marked the escaped as quarry not yet run down. Before them, the Eye opened in patient storm and fire. The surviving Relictors vanished into it believing, even then, even after the ruin of their fortress, the death of their masters, and the judgment of the Imperium entire, that they alone had possessed the will to weaponize hell for the good of humanity. And because this was the 41st millennium, because every noble certainty rotted eventually into another shape of horror, that belief was perhaps the darkest thing they had carried with them at all.